Hello the world, hello the internet, hello Jason Isaacs, hello people who are looking for an overview of American government. You've come to the right place. This is the first part of two videos on American government, an attempt to bring that all together so that people who struggle to see it, perhaps people who are steeped in the UK political tradition, can try to get a grip or try to get a grasp of the various moving parts that make America such a fascinating system. Before we do that, this music in the background, this is American government, so this is Can. This I just heard the other day. It was on Guy Garvey's estimable radio show. Just another track for which I should really get around to thanking Mr. Garvey someday, should I ever meet the man. It's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. I wonder where it's been all my life. I thought it was just released last week. Turns out this is from the early 1970s. I believe it's called Krautrock, with apologies to our Teutonic cousins. It's amazing. You should listen to it. It just sounds staggering. But this presentation is going to be long enough anyway, so I should probably stop at that point, or at least turn it down. So, American government and the sum of the parts, in particular the moving parts. When we're looking at American government, I think it's very, very easy to obsess about the objects, largely because the objects are the easy bit. We've got the Constitution, we've got the President, we've got Congress, we've got the Supreme Court. And what they do is fairly straightforward. It's described by the Constitution, and the structure and mechanics of these objects, that's straightforward. You just read the Constitution, you learn it. How they fit together, on the other hand, and how they move is really rather complex, and that's really what this illustration here was designed to show. The complexity of the moving parts. The relationships between the objects is where the higher echelon of Marx begins and ends, and if you want to get the top grades, you really do have to be in a position to explain how all of these parts move together to create the whole of American government. So a question about the Congress will involve discussion of the President and, of course, SCOTUS. A discussion of the President will, of course, involve the other branches and so on and so forth. A question about the Constitution will necessarily involve what came before it and whether or not it delivers what they wanted it to do. So the relationship between the objects is where the money really is, and it's harder, and that's why this is where the big marks live. So enough chat, let's push on. Now, what we're going to do is we'll look at what's great about these things, where there's a problem with these things, and then try to look at the relationships that follow. So what's great about the Constitution? Well, the Constitution defines what can and can't be done. This is constitutionalism. And it contrasts with the UK system. In the UK system, we have parliamentarianism, which basically means that at any given time, Parliament decides what the Constitution does or does not mean, what the Constitution allows or does not allow. That is, in the UK, determined by Parliament. In the United States, it's different. It's the Constitution. And I suppose on the plus side of that is that the Constitution is short, clear, and relatively comprehensible. And it does, by and large, deliver constitutional goals. Now, these are very, very important. If you want to ask a question about, or answer a question about, does the Constitution deliver on the Founding Fathers' goals? Is the Constitution fit for purpose? Then you need to understand what those goals were, what indeed those purposes were. And that is to be found in these. That's the primacy of the individual, the primacy of the state, the prevention of tyranny, and the enshrinement of democracy. And that's done through various mechanisms. There's a Bill of Rights, federalism, the separation of powers, and checks and balances, and the whole of the democratic process, elections, left, right, and centre. I explore this elsewhere in my various presentations. Do try to check it out if you're curious. And any questions you've got, ping them to me. I'm always more than happy to answer them either in email or perhaps even on an online tutorial, but more of that later. So, What about the problems? Well, the obvious problem is that it was written in 1789. And as a result, there's some weird things in it, and there are some conspicuous absences in it. In terms of the weird things in it, you need to be looking primarily at things like the Second Amendment. That's the easy one. The whole idea of having guns came from a time when you were under existential threat. I mean, you just had a revolution. Things were far from certain, and so the right of the people to keep and bear arms for the security of the state kind of followed. Perhaps less relevant in 2016, unless you live in the Great Plains. But no, that is definitely a weird thing. Perhaps more odious than weird is, of course, the 3/5 clause, whereby slaves were worth 3/5 of a person. Yes, they amended over the top of that, but you look hard enough in the Constitution, it's still there. The things missing, well, obviously there's nothing in the Constitution about toilets. There's nothing in the Constitution about LGBT issues. There's nothing in the Constitution about abortion, and there's nothing in the Constitution about drugs, although of course the whole of the Constitution was written on cannabis, by which I mean that the Constitution was written on hemp, which is of course industrial cannabis, the fibre that went on which the paper the fibers that made the paper on which the Constitution was printed were from the marijuana plants, and George Washington was a prolific cannabis farmer, although I don't think he went around selling it in the backs of pubs. Anyway, don't do drugs, kids, by the way. It's really stupid. It makes you very boring. So there are things missing from the Constitution. At the same time, codification is never as clear and comprehensible as people would like. There's things missing. There are things that are confusing. There are things that are ambiguous. And the examples I would choose there are the power clauses and the Eighth Amendment. Just a little thing on the power clauses there. This is all about the inherent contradiction that exists in federalism, the idea that states get to sort out their own things unless the federal government decides otherwise, and the federal government will normally decide otherwise by virtue of the power clauses. And you can remember that by Pisces. You've got the power clauses, and that is interstate commerce, and of course the elastic clause, and finally the supremacy clause. So there you go, Pisces. You will never again forget the power clauses. The Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. Well, that should go without saying. What is cruel and unusual? Well, I think we would all agree that cruel and unusual punishments are probably a bad thing. However, what is cruel and unusual is going to change depending upon the time and the person you ask the question. And from that, it should be evident that all roads lead to SCOTUS. All roads lead to SCOTUS, and that leads itself to the question of the imperial judiciary. And then the next question is, to what extent does the Constitution fulfill its stated goals? Well, remember, these are our stated goals over here. And so does the Constitution deliver? Well, do we have all of these things? And again, it will depend largely on who you ask and what their political persuasion is. Now, one more thing before we leave this particular thing. If we're looking at things that are all about the Constitution being out of date, the most obvious one, I think, for me, is always war. Now, Edwin Starr had a good point. What is it good for? Well, war is a very good way of exploring the various limitations in the Constitution. War in 1789 was a very mannered, organised thing. War in 2016 is very, very different, and the Constitution has not evolved to keep up with war. Consequently, the position vis-a-vis military action is a complete and utter mess. It's perhaps best described as the relationship that a child might have with his parents. Congress is the father, the president is the child. The president asks Congress if he can go out clubbing. The parent says no. And then the president has a choice. Well, can he get away with it? Does he have the money to do it? What are the chances of his being caught? What are the chances of him getting into trouble while he's out there? Because if he gets into trouble and his parents have to come and bail him out, then he's in big trouble. If he runs out of money while he's out there, he's also in big trouble. So that is perhaps the best way of trying to describe war military action in the present tense. The president has to look at going to war the same way that a child might look at sneaking out to go clubbing, in defiance of his parents' issues. He might get away with it, he might not. Can he carry the cost of things going wrong? Anyway, again, a discussion for another day, and one that is carried in other presentations. So there we go. That is the setup. This is just looking at the Constitution. This is looking at the objects in the Constitution. Let's look now at the critical relationships. Now, the critical relationships in terms of the President and the Congress and the Supreme Court, I explore later. All of those are obviously defined by the Constitution. What I want to look at here is the cause and the effect. The Declaration of Independence says all people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, yada, 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 and that gives rise to our constitutional principles. The question then becomes, to what extent does the Constitution fulfill those? Does the Constitution deliver the stated aims of the Declaration of Independence as articulated in the constitutional principles, or does it deliver gridlock? What is the role of SCOTUS in unraveling that gridlock? How do we feel about these unelected judges being in the centre of everything? The imperial judiciary is the price that we pay for this supposed constitutional clarity. And this really is the key thing about the Constitution and the critical relationships. Critical relationships between cause and effect, the critical relationships between intent and eventual action. That's, I think, where it gets really, really interesting. Right, I have gone on far too long there, and I can see that time is necessarily moving on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call quits there. This is part one. Part two will follow immediately, so do keep your eye out for that. And I'll leave you with a bit more can if I can find it. I don't think I can. No, I can't. So I'm just going to call it quits there and see you very, very shortly.